The only real difference between a BBC newsreader on the 10 o'clock news, telling you the news, and someone in their house with a mobile phone webcasting, the only real difference apart from scale is trust. And if you don't trust an organisation, if you don't trust that what's coming out of the speaker or your television is true, well, then what's the point, really?
Let's turn our attention to the Sunday Times reporting today that BBC staff and board members are demanding answers from the Director General, Tim Davie, about his handling of the Hugh Edwards case. It's understood Edwards was subject to a confidential disciplinary process when he resigned. But it seems that Tim Davie and 3 other board members were aware of his arrest in November. Others, including those in the newsroom, were left blindsided. The young person at the centre of the allegations last year against the presenter, the first to be made public, says he felt groomed by Hugh Edwards. And the Sunday Times has also learnt that the BBC is still paying for therapy for a woman who first complained about him in 2021. Peter, how would you assess the BBC's handling of this situation?
So I don't think there's any suggestion at any stage that anybody in the BBC knew or even suspected that Hugh Edwards was accessing paedophilic images. And he has pleaded guilty to that. I would imagine will be convicted and sentenced, and that we can sort of say horrendous, awful, dreadful, but in the context of this conversation, set it to one side. The problem in terms of how he worked, acted, comported himself within the BBC is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. And there are people that he abused his relationship with who were both employees and people outside the organisation that he used his celebrity status to manipulate in various ways. That is very clear. The BBC have handled this badly, as they handle everything badly when it comes to scandals, whether it's Strictly Come Dancing, no matter what it is. They seem to just be a very large organisation that is not nimble, that cannot react, that cannot give people the correct information. There are so many people angry about why Hugh Edwards received £200,000, for example, within a 5-month period when the BBC knew about his arrest. Now, people will talk about HR, they will talk about law, they will talk about employment law within that. I get that. But what is clear is that a lot was known about Hugh Edwards and how he treated people and how he treated colleagues. And open secret is sort of too strong a term, but there were definite suspicions, and there were people he knew, and there were people in the media who had heard all sorts of rumours. I'm one of them, and I can say, and we're all broadcasters, I'm going to stay on the right side of the line here, don't worry, within 48 hours of the original allegations coming out about Hugh Edwards, before his name was in the public domain, 3 young men contacted me, one of whom had worked with him, 2 others who hadn't worked with him but had come in contact with him, to mention that they had been contacted in a similar way. And this is clearly a pattern of behaviour. It was not dealt with by the BBC, and unfortunately there are just far too many examples of the BBC not looking after their staff. And the people I feel very sorry for are, number one, the young children in the paedophilic images who I think have been forgotten in all of this. Number 2, his colleagues who were targeted. And number 3, his colleagues who weren't targeted but have been tarred with this, because the BBC is under huge fire today. It's been under huge fire all this week. And there are lots of very, very good, people who come in, do the shift correctly, work hard, in front or behind of the camera, who did not get the same salary as Hugh Edwards, did not get the same recognition as Hugh Edwards, was not lionised and treated in the same way. And what we've seen is a pattern of behaviour, not just from him, but also from the BBC, in terms of people who are big presenters, high salaries, untouchable.
And Latika, one of the things that many people have raised as being a real issue here is that the head of news, Deborah Turnis, was made aware of Edward's arrest. She knew about this in advance, and yet the BBC, Clive Myrie went on air on Wednesday and said, just to be clear, we here at BBC News are editorially independent when reporting on the corporation. We only learned about his arrest and charges with the rest of the media on Monday. That just wasn't true. How can the head of that division, Clive Myrie's boss, the boss of everybody in the newsroom, know and allow them to go on air and say that? It undermines the people who are working hard. And you just wonder what the decision-making is within that corporation that allows that to happen.
Well, I'm very intrigued to read in the Sunday Times this morning that Lisa Nandy, the new Culture Secretary, has tried to make contact with Tim Davie and hasn't yet succeeded. And I think that's going to be a direction for the new Labor government, demanding answers from the BBC about what has gone on here. I would just caution, though, that an arrest is not guilty as charged. An arrest is an arrest, and under this system, you are innocent until proven guilty. Now, that doesn't in any way defend, it's not seeking to defend the decision not to inform staff of each stage of this process. But I do think we need to be careful that at the time of somebody's arrest, that doesn't necessarily say they're guilty, and they do have to be afforded innocent until proven guilty.
Just on, excuse me, Lisa Nandy, the new Culture Secretary, I think for clarity, she has spoken to Tim Davie on the phone, but is not spoken to the chairman of the BBC.
Sorry, yes,
yet.
you're right. Sorry.
No,
My
that's
apologies.
fine. Just to
And
clarify.
I think as well, what's really interesting here is the idea, and it was raised by Jeremy Vine on his programme on Channel 5, equally a BBC presenter. He said, was Hugh Edwards asked when he was arrested, and those few people at the BBC who were made aware of it, was he asked if he was guilty?
Yeah.
Because if he said no, and then obviously he went on to plead guilty in court,
Yep.
it's not like he's been found guilty, he admitted it,
Yep.
then
Yes.
that's an issue. And if he said, no, I'm not guilty, sorry, if he said no and then he went on and did it, or if he said yes, I mean, either of those
Yes.
things, surely that's a way to claw back. I guess the question is, did the BBC ask him if he was guilty?
Yeah,
Which I think is a legitimate question
Yeah, of
if
course
an
it
employee
is.
has been arrested on
And
such serious
absolutely
charges.
at the heart of this is, and the difference, BBC is the world's largest news organization, but essentially, apart from the scale, apart from the resources, the only real difference between a BBC newsreader on the 10 o'clock news, telling you the news, and someone in their house with a mobile phone webcasting, the only real difference apart from scale is trust. And if you don't trust an organisation, if you don't trust that what's coming out of the speaker or your television is true, well, then what's the point, really? And as you correctly point out with the BBC the other night, I mean, Clive Marry, who is now basically sort of Hugh Edwards' replacement as the sort of chief newscaster, telling us this, which actually it's a bit more complicated. The most generous interpretation is it's a bit more complicated. Deborah Turnus knew about this and we weren't told. And it's yet again, the BBC is just in serious trouble because they're just not being straight on this. And they say every time they have an inquiry, every time, where's the inquiry on Russell Brand? That was a year ago. Peter Johnson, the former head of BBC Northern Ireland. Where is that report? Why is it taking a year? There are so many things that are so basic, straightforward, that need to be given to licence fee payers who deserve the truth. And actually, the BBC is acting like a political organisation. The same arguments about the sort of political class establishment not telling people the truth and being straightforward.
I find it staggering also because it's not like the BBC doesn't have precedent of actually...
Lessons will be learned, Colin,
Well,
except
indeed.
they never are.
Well, this is the problem. You should read Rosamund Irwin's reporting, by the way, in the Sunday Times today. It's a whole new layer of complex revelations about Hugh Edwards and about the BBC's handling of all of this, and those 4 board members who were made aware of his arrest last November but kept it secret. Part of that is that the Metropolitan Police apparently asked them to keep it confidential, but it has led to all sorts of confusion and complication.
But it's also this woman who's having therapy paid
Yes,
for
exactly.
by the BBC because of inappropriate conduct by Hugh Edwards. They actually gave her name to Hugh
Or
Edwards.
certainly made her identifiable.
Okay, she was clearly enough
Yes,
identifiable
exactly.
that Hugh Edwards was then able to go and contact her again and tell her that she should withdraw the complaint.
Which is astonishing.
Which is astonishing, which is all in that piece in the Sunday Times. And I really would urge you to read it. It's very, very thorough and eye-opening.